February 1968. NVA Colonel Bui Tin crouched beside a massive American supply depot his forces had just overrun near Khe Sanh. Mountains of ammunition stretched beyond the horizon. Medical supplies worth more than North Vietnam's entire health budget. Artillery shells stacked like skyscrapers. His first thought, "We've struck gold, enough to arm 10 divisions. But then Bui Tin examined the shipping labels, manufacturing dates from just weeks ago. Serial numbers revealing these weren't rare stockpiles. They were routine deliveries. One abandoned dump contained more firepower than his entire regional command possessed. The terrifying realization hit him like artillery fire. If Americans can abandon this much without blinking, what do they still have? What Bui Tin didn't know was that captured supplies were just the tip of a massive iceberg. For 3 years, a shadow economy had been feeding American weapons directly into NVA hands, no battles required. It started with corrupt South Vietnamese officers who discovered American quartermasters rarely counted inventory twice. Why fight for weapons when you could buy them? ARVN colonels were selling entire truck convoys to the highest bidders, usually NVA purchasing agents operating in plain sight in Saigon's markets. The Americans knew. CIA operatives turned blind eye to supply shrinkage in exchange for intelligence favors from the same corrupt officers. A missing crate of M16 meant names of Viet Cong cells. Vanished artillery shells bought maps of tunnel networks. Down at Saigon's docks, stevedores perfected the art of selective blindness. American supply ships arrived weekly with manifests listing thousands of crates, but somehow, between ship and warehouse, entire containers would vanish. Dock supervisors filed reports blaming inventory discrepancies on monsoon damage or clerical errors. The real money was in medical supplies: morphine, antibiotics, surgical equipment, items worth fortunes on Southeast Asia's black markets. Vietnamese translators, officially hired to help American logistics officers, secretly served as middlemen. They'd approach NVA buyers with shopping lists. "What do you need? We can get it by Thursday." American deserters discovered the most direct route. Why risk court-martial when you could trade your unit's weapons cache for safe passage to Cambodia? Entire squads went AWOL, establishing black market operations in border towns. They'd sell everything: rifles, radios, even classified maps showing American patrol routes. The corruption reached stunning levels. Quartermaster sergeants falsified inventory reports to cover systematic theft. Supply convoys were ambushed at predetermined locations, allowing drivers to claim plausible deniability while selling their cargo to prearranged NVA buyers. Both sides split the profits. Military police units that should have stopped this trafficking instead protected it. Corrupt MPs took percentage cuts from deserter operations, ensuring safe transport of stolen weapons to communist forces. They'd even provide escort services, guaranteeing black market convoys safe passage through American checkpoints. The network grew so sophisticated that American and NVA officers began coordinating directly. Secret meetings in Saigon bars where enemies became business partners. American captains would provide intelligence about upcoming supply shipments. NVA agents would guarantee safe zones for American units willing to lose equipment. By 1968, this underground economy was moving more weapons to communist forces than combat captures. American military leadership either ignored the corruption or actively participated. Some generals figured it was cheaper to replace stolen supplies than fight the black market, especially when stolen weapons came with valuable intelligence about NVA operations. The most shocking aspect wasn't the scale of corruption, but how routine it became. American soldiers treated weapons trafficking like any other wartime business opportunity. Vietnamese middlemen established permanent offices in major cities. NVA purchasing departments operated with military efficiency, complete with procurement budgets and shopping lists. This shadow war created relationships that transcended official hostilities. American deserters teaching NVA soldiers how to maintain captured equipment. Vietnamese black market dealers providing safe houses for AWOL American troops. Former enemies becoming business partners in an economy that profited from prolonged conflict. When Colonel Bui Tin discovered that abandoned supply cache, he was seeing only the visible portion of America's military-industrial complex. The invisible portion, the weapons flowing through corruption networks, was already arming his forces faster than battlefield victories ever could. The black market pipeline had been feeding the NVA for years, but those shipping labels would soon teach Bui Tin a more terrifying lesson about American capabilities. Colonel Bui Tin hadn't always been shocked by superior firepower. Born into the French colonial system in 1927, he'd learned early that technological disadvantages could become advantages with the right tactics. As a young officer at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, Tin watched Vietnamese forces accomplish the impossible. The French had superior artillery, air support, and modern weapons. They controlled the valley's strategic positions with concrete bunkers and interlocking fields of fire. French commanders dismissed Vietnamese capabilities, calling them rice farmers with rifles. But General Giap had taught Tin something the French never understood. Superior firepower means nothing without superior will. While French forces relied on their technological edge, Vietnamese fighters dragged artillery pieces up mountainsides by hand. They dug tunnels that turned French advantages into death traps. They captured French weapons and used them against their original owners. Tin personally led raids that seized French equipment, then immediately deployed it in the same battles. Captured mortars became Vietnamese mortars within hours. French radio equipment allowed Vietnamese forces to intercept enemy communications. Every technological advantage the French possessed eventually worked against them. The lesson was clear. Patient, determined fighters could defeat any technological superiority. The French had better weapons, but Vietnamese forces had better reasons to fight. When Dien Bien Phu fell, it proved that industrial might couldn't overcome revolutionary will. Tin rose through the ranks by mastering this philosophy. During the late 1950s, he perfected guerrilla tactics that turned enemy advantages into weaknesses. American-supplied ARVN forces had better equipment, but Tin's units moved faster, struck harder, and disappeared before superior firepower could respond. He became expert at analyzing captured weapons to understand enemy capabilities. Every seized rifle told a story about manufacturing capacity. Every captured radio revealed communication patterns. Tin built detailed intelligence about enemy supply chains by studying the equipment his forces captured. The patterns seemed consistent. Technologically superior enemies always underestimated Vietnamese determination. They relied on firepower instead of strategy, on equipment instead of motivation. Tin had seen this movie before with the French. The Americans would follow the same script. By 1965, when American combat troops arrived, Tin felt confident about the outcome. Americans had better weapons than the French, but they were fighting the same war for the same reasons. They'd establish bases, rely on superior firepower, and gradually realize they couldn't defeat an enemy who refused to fight conventionally. Tin's personal philosophy had been proven in battle. Superior firepower means nothing without superior will. He'd watched French forces abandon positions despite overwhelming advantages. He'd seen ARVN units flee despite American equipment and training. Technology couldn't replace the will to fight. His early encounters with American forces seemed to confirm this pattern. Americans had helicopters, but Vietnamese fighters had tunnel networks. Americans had artillery, but Vietnamese forces had mobility. Americans had superior equipment, but Vietnamese forces had superior knowledge of terrain and population. Tin's confidence grew with each successful engagement. American units fought predictably, relying on firepower to solve tactical problems. They'd call in airstrikes instead of maneuvering. They'd use artillery instead of intelligence. They treated every problem as a nail because they only had hammers. The Americans seemed to repeat every French mistake, just with better equipment. They established isolated bases that became targets. They relied on technology that required constant resupply. They fought the war their enemies wanted them to fight. Tin believed the American war would follow the same trajectory as French defeat. Initial technological advantages would gradually erode as Vietnamese forces adapted. American public opinion would turn against an expensive, seemingly endless conflict. Eventually, superior American firepower would prove as useless as superior French firepower. This confidence shaped every strategic decision Tin made through 1967. He planned for a long war of attrition, knowing Vietnamese forces could outlast any technologically superior enemy. The pattern had worked against the French. It would work against the Americans, but that abandoned supply cache near Khe Sanh would shatter every assumption Tin had built about technological warfare. The shipping labels would reveal something the French never possessed, an industrial capacity that defied every lesson of revolutionary war. January 30th, 1968. The Tet Offensive launched with coordinated attacks across South Vietnam. NVA and Viet Cong forces struck over 100 cities simultaneously, catching American forces off guard. But for Colonel Bui Tin, the real shock came after the fighting ended. His units had overrun Firebase Charlie near Khe Sanh during the initial assault. American defenders evacuated so quickly they abandoned everything. Tin expected the usual haul, some rifles, ammunition, maybe medical supplies. What he found defied imagination. Warehouses stretched beyond the horizon, cases of ammunition stacked higher than buildings in Hanoi, artillery shells arranged in perfect rows like a mechanical forest. Medical supplies worth more than North Vietnam's entire health budget for a decade. Tin's men couldn't believe what they were seeing. Crates of M16 rifles still in factory wrapping, mortar rounds manufactured just weeks earlier. Communications equipment more advanced than anything in Soviet inventory. This wasn't a supply depot. It was an industrial monument. The initial celebration was intoxicating. Soldiers who'd fought with rifles older than themselves suddenly had access to cutting-edge weaponry. Medics who'd operated without proper supplies found surgical instruments they'd only seen in textbooks. Communications specialists discovered radio equipment that could coordinate operations across entire provinces. But Tin's training kicked in. He began analyzing serial numbers, manufacturing dates, shipping labels. The mathematics were sobering. This single abandoned base contained more ammunition than his entire regional command possessed. The medical supplies could equip every North Vietnamese hospital. The communications gear represented technology decades ahead of anything Hanoi could produce. Then came the terrifying realization. The shipping manifests revealed this wasn't a special stockpile. It was routine resupply, weekly deliveries, standard inventory levels. The Americans had abandoned more firepower in one base than most armies possessed in total. Other NVA units reported similar discoveries across South Vietnam. Firebase Alpha near Da Nang, abandoned with enough artillery shells to supply a division for months. Fire Support Base Bravo in the Delta, left behind with medical supplies worth millions. Every overrun American position revealed the same pattern of casual abundance. Tin's intelligence staff began calculating the implications. If Americans could abandon this much equipment without affecting operations, what did their total capacity look like? The numbers became increasingly disturbing. Single American bases held more supplies than entire North Vietnamese provinces. The celebration among his troops gradually shifted to uncomfortable silence. Soldiers examining captured weapons realized they were holding instruments of war manufactured with precision and resources beyond their comprehension. Every rifle represented industrial capacity that North Vietnam couldn't match in decades. Tin studied captured maintenance logs that revealed the true scope of American operations. Helicopter flight schedules showing hundreds of aircraft per base. artillery fire missions consuming more ammunition daily than NVA units used monthly. Supply convoys delivering fresh equipment to replace anything damaged or lost. The psychological impact was devastating. Tin's forces had fought desperately to capture these positions, suffering heavy casualties. But the Americans had evacuated casually, treating irreplaceable equipment as disposable. What kind of enemy could afford such waste? Intelligence reports from other commanders painted the same picture across South Vietnam. American forces had abandoned hundreds of similar caches during the Tet Offensive. Each one represented more military capability than entire NVA divisions possessed. Tin began understanding a fundamental truth about this war. The Americans weren't fighting with everything they had, they were fighting with their leftovers. The equipment his forces had captured represented a fraction of total American military production, a rounding error in Pentagon budgets. The captured supplies revealed manufacturing dates that told an even more disturbing story. Weapons produced just weeks earlier. Ammunition, manufactured faster than NVA forces, could expend it. Medical supplies replaced before expiration dates. The Americans were producing war materials faster than anyone could consume them. This wasn't the French pattern Tin had expected. The French had fought with finite resources, gradually weakened by losses. The Americans seemed to possess infinite resources, strengthened by production that never slowed. Standing among mountains of abandoned American equipment, Tin faced an uncomfortable question. If this was what Americans could afford to lose, what were they keeping? But the abandoned supplies told only half the story. What Colonel Bui Tin couldn't see was the systematic corruption that had been feeding American weapons to communist forces for years, corruption that reached the highest levels of the American military command. The rot started with quartermaster operations across South Vietnam. Sergeant Major William Hayes ran supply operations at Long Binh, the largest American base in Vietnam. His official job was managing inventory for 50,000 troops. His unofficial job was running the most profitable black market operation in Southeast Asia. Hayes had discovered something remarkable. Nobody counted American supplies twice. Manifests showed what arrived, but nobody verified what stayed. A convoy of 100 rifles could become 80 rifles with a simple paperwork adjustment. Missing weapons were blamed on combat losses or inventory discrepancies. The beauty of Hayes's system was its simplicity. Vietnamese interpreters, officially hired to help with logistics, secretly served as salesmen. They'd approach NVA purchasing agents with catalogs. M16 rifles, $200 each. Mortar rounds, $50 per shell. Medical supplies, negotiable depending on quantity. But Hayes wasn't operating alone. Colonel Robert Morrison, the base commander, took a 30% cut from all black market sales. Morrison justified the arrangement as intelligence gathering, selling weapons to track NVA supply lines. In reality, he was funding a comfortable retirement through weapons trafficking. The corruption network extended far beyond individual bases. General Thomas Bradley, commanding officer of the 25th Infantry Division, had established what amounted to a military-industrial crime syndicate. Bradley's forces would stage fake ambushes on predetermined supply convoys, allowing drivers to claim combat losses while selling cargo to prearranged NVA buyers. These weren't small-scale operations. Bradley's network moved entire truck convoys monthly. 100-vehicle supply trains would depart American bases fully loaded and arrive at forward positions mysteriously empty. Official reports blamed enemy action. Unofficial reality involved carefully choreographed business transactions. The most profitable items weren't weapons, they were medical supplies. Morphine, antibiotics, surgical equipment commanded premium prices on Southeast Asian black markets. A single crate of medical supplies worth $10,000 to the Army could sell for $100,000 to desperate NVA medical units. Vietnamese middlemen became millionaires facilitating these transactions. Nguyen Van Duc officially worked as a translator for American logistics officers. Unofficially, he operated the largest weapons brokerage in South Vietnam. Duke's office in downtown Saigon maintained price lists for every type of American military equipment. The corruption reached absurd levels. American and NVA officers began meeting directly in Saigon restaurants to negotiate weapon sales. Captain James Fletcher would provide intelligence about upcoming supply shipments. Major Pham Van Min would guarantee safe passage for American convoys willing to lose equipment at specified locations. Military police units that should have prevented trafficking instead protected it. MP Lieutenant Colonel David Walsh established escort services for black market convoys, guaranteeing safe transport through American checkpoints. Walsh's MPs would even provide armed security for weapons dealers, ensuring successful delivery of stolen American equipment to communist forces. The Pentagon knew about the corruption, but calculated it was cheaper to replace stolen supplies than fight the black market. Defense Department audits showed billions of dollars in unaccounted equipment losses, but investigators were told to focus on combat effectiveness rather than supply chain integrity. Some American commanders actively encouraged the corruption. General Morrison reasoned that weapons sales provided valuable intelligence about NVA operations. Every transaction revealed communist supply needs, command structures, and operational priorities. The Pentagon was essentially paying for intelligence by allowing systematic theft of military equipment. The corruption created relationships that transcended official hostilities. American deserters established permanent black market operations in border towns, selling weapons while teaching NVA forces maintenance procedures. Vietnamese dealers provided safe houses for AWOL American troops. Former enemies became business partners in an economy that profited from prolonged conflict. By 1968, this shadow economy was moving more weapons to communist forces than battlefield captures. Systematic theft had become institutionalized across American military operations. Supply chain corruption was feeding NVA forces more efficiently than successful military operations ever could. When Colonel Bui Tin examined those shipping labels near Khe Sanh, he was seeing evidence of American production capacity. But he couldn't see the corruption networks that had been arming his forces for years through systematic theft and organized crime within the American military establishment. The abandoned supplies were shocking enough. The systematic corruption feeding weapons to his forces was even more revealing about American military culture and capabilities. Back at his command post, Colonel Bui Tin ordered his intelligence staff to calculate exactly what they'd captured. The initial euphoria was fading, replaced by methodical analysis that would shatter his understanding of modern warfare. Captain Nguyen Van Thieu, Tin's logistics officer, began with basic arithmetic. The ammunition alone, millions of rounds of small arms fire, thousands of artillery shells, hundreds of mortar rounds, could supply Tin's entire division for 8 months of intensive combat. In a single abandoned base, the Americans had left behind more firepower than most national armies possessed. But Thieu's calculations revealed something more disturbing. Cross-referencing serial numbers with captured American documents, they discovered these weapons had been manufactured just weeks earlier. The M16 rifles bore production dates from December 1967. Artillery shells showed January 1968 manufacturing stamps. This wasn't old stockpile. It was fresh production. Tin studied the shipping manifests his forces had recovered. The paperwork revealed a logistics system that operated like clockwork. Weekly supply flights, monthly equipment rotations, quarterly inventory replacements. The Americans were treating war supplies like grocery deliveries, routine, predictable, endless. The mathematics became increasingly sobering. Intelligence reports from other NVA commanders described similar discoveries across South Vietnam. Firebase Delta, abandoned with enough medical supplies to operate every North Vietnamese hospital for a year. Fire Support Base. Echo, left behind with communications equipment worth more than Hanoi's entire telecommunications budget. Tin's staff began comparing these individual discoveries to North Vietnam's total military capacity. The results were devastating. Single American bases contained more military equipment than entire North Vietnamese provinces. One abandoned supply dump represented more industrial output than North Vietnam could produce in decades. The serial number analysis revealed the most terrifying truth. American weapons manufacturing was accelerating, not slowing. Production dates showed increasing output throughout 1967 and early 1968. While North Vietnamese factories struggled to produce basic equipment, American industries were ramping up production to unprecedented levels. Captain Tu presented calculations that defied belief. Based on captured inventory records, American forces in Vietnam were consuming more ammunition monthly than North Vietnam produced annually. They were discarding more medical supplies weekly than North Vietnamese hospitals received yearly. They were abandoning more equipment casually than most armies acquired intentionally. The comparison with Soviet supply patterns was equally disturbing. Russian military aid to North Vietnam arrived sporadically, in limited quantities, with constant negotiations about payment and political conditions. American supplies flowed continuously, abundantly, apparently without economic constraints or political limitations. Tin examined captured American maintenance schedules that revealed operational scope beyond imagination. Individual American bases operated more helicopters than North Vietnam's entire air force. Single artillery batteries fired more rounds daily than NVA regional commands possessed in total. The scale of American military operations dwarfed everything Tin had experienced. Intelligence reports from Hanoi confirmed the pattern across multiple theaters. American forces in Vietnam represented a fraction of total American military capacity. The Pentagon was simultaneously fighting in Vietnam, maintaining global commitments, and expanding production capabilities. This wasn't total war. It was routine military operations. The psychological impact on Tin's staff was profound. Officers who'd spent careers calculating resource allocation suddenly faced an enemy with apparently unlimited resources. Logistics specialists who'd mastered scarcity economics encountered abundance beyond comprehension. Tin realized the fundamental assumption underlying North Vietnamese strategy was wrong. They'd planned for a war of attrition, believing superior American firepower would gradually exhaust itself against determined resistance. But the captured supplies revealed Americans weren't being exhausted. They were being resupplied faster than they could expend materials. The mathematical impossibility became clear. North Vietnamese forces were fighting an enemy that produced war materials faster than anyone could consume them. Every captured weapon was immediately replaced. Every destroyed supply dump was quickly restocked. Every tactical victory was strategically meaningless against such production capacity. Standing among mountains of abandoned American equipment, Tin faced an uncomfortable mathematical reality. They weren't fighting America's military. They were fighting America's surplus production. And the numbers didn't add up to victory. But the sheer quantity of abandoned supplies was only the beginning of Colonel Bui Tin's education. As his technical specialists examined the captured equipment more closely, they discovered weapon systems that shouldn't have existed, at least not in 1968. Senior Lieutenant Pham Van Duc, Tin's chief weapons expert, had trained on Soviet military equipment for 15 years. He'd examined captured French weapons at Dien Bien Phu. He'd studied American equipment seized from ARVN forces. But nothing had prepared him for what he found in those American supply caches. The night vision equipment alone represented technology decades ahead of anything in Soviet inventory. American soldiers were carrying individual night vision scopes that allowed them to fight effectively in complete darkness. These weren't crude infrared systems. They were sophisticated light amplification devices that turned night into day. Duke's analysis revealed the tactical implications. NVA forces had relied on darkness as their primary advantage. Night attacks, dawn raids, twilight ambushes, all the tactics that had worked against the French became useless against an enemy that could see perfectly in darkness. The Americans had eliminated night as a tactical factor. The communications equipment was even more revolutionary. Tin's forces used primitive radio systems that barely functioned across provincial boundaries. American units carried portable radios that could coordinate operations across the entire Southeast Asian theater. Individual soldiers possessed communication capabilities that exceeded North Vietnam's national command structure. But the most shocking discovery was the artillery guidance systems. Tin had assumed American artillery was simply more numerous than NVA capabilities. The captured fire control computers revealed something far more disturbing. American artillery was more accurate than anything previously imagined possible. The guidance systems could calculate firing solutions that accounted for wind speed, temperature, humidity, even the rotation of the Earth. American artillery could hit targets NVA forces couldn't even locate. The technology made traditional defensive positions obsolete. There was nowhere to hide from weapons that never missed. Lieutenant Duke discovered prototype weapon systems that weren't supposed to exist for another decade. Laser rangefinders that could measure distances with unprecedented accuracy. Computer-guided mortars that could adjust trajectory mid-flight. Artillery shells with primitive guidance systems that could correct course after firing. The medical equipment revealed similar technological gaps. American field hospitals carried surgical instruments that surpassed anything in Hanoi's best facilities. Portable X-ray machines, emergency surgical equipment that could perform operations impossible in North Vietnamese hospitals. Medical technology that could save lives NVA doctors couldn't even attempt to treat. Most disturbing were the experimental drugs found in American medical supplies, antibiotics that didn't exist in civilian medicine, pain medications more effective than morphine, blood plasma substitutes that could treat injuries previously considered fatal. The Americans were fighting with medical technology that wouldn't be available to civilians for years. The weapons analysis revealed a fundamental shift in warfare itself. Traditional military tactics assumed rough technological parity between opposing forces. Superior numbers could overcome superior equipment. Better tactics could defeat better weapons. But the captured American equipment represented such overwhelming technological superiority that traditional military thinking became irrelevant. Tin realized his forces weren't fighting a conventional enemy. They were fighting an enemy from the future. The technological gap made captured weapons almost unusable without extensive training. NVA soldiers couldn't operate advanced radio equipment. Artillery specialists couldn't understand computer-guided fire control systems. Medical personnel couldn't utilize sophisticated surgical instruments. The psychological impact was devastating. Tin's officers had built careers mastering military technology. Suddenly, they were children examining incomprehensible toys. The technological gap wasn't measured in years. It was measured in decades. Intelligence reports from other NVA commanders confirmed the pattern. American forces across Vietnam possessed technology that defied contemporary military understanding. They were fighting with tomorrow's weapons against yesterday's tactics, standing among captured American equipment that seemed more like science fiction than military hardware. Tin faced an uncomfortable realization. The Americans weren't just technologically superior, they were technologically dominant to a degree that made conventional resistance potentially impossible. The weapons that shouldn't exist were rewriting the rules of warfare, and Tin was beginning to understand that North Vietnamese strategy was based on rules that no longer applied. But the most damaging source of American weapons flowing to NVA forces wasn't battlefield captures or black market corruption. It was American soldiers themselves. By 1968, desertion rates had reached crisis levels, and many AWOL troops discovered that selling military secrets and equipment provided the perfect escape route from an increasingly unpopular war. Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez had been operating a black market weapons business from a Saigon apartment for 8 months when Colonel Bui Tin's intelligence network finally identified him. Rodriguez wasn't hiding, he was advertising. His operation had become so sophisticated that NVA purchasing agents treated him like an official supplier. Rodriguez's story was typical of hundreds of American deserters who'd established similar operations across South Vietnam. Facing his third combat tour, watching friends die in a war most Americans no longer supported, Rodriguez made a calculated decision. Why risk death for a cause nobody believed in when you could profit from the chaos? The desertion networks operated with military efficiency. Rodriguez maintained detailed inventories of available equipment, complete with pricing schedules and delivery timelines. M16 rifles, $300 each, delivery within 48 hours. Mortar rounds, $75 per shell, minimum order 20 units. Radio equipment, negotiable depending on specifications and quantity. What made deserter operations particularly valuable to NVA forces wasn't just the weapons, it was the training. Rodriguez and his associates provided comprehensive instruction on American equipment maintenance, tactical procedures, and operational patterns. They were essentially running military academies for communist forces. American deserters taught NVA soldiers how to operate captured radio equipment effectively. They explained American patrol patterns, base security procedures, and supply convoy schedules. They provided intelligence that no amount of battlefield reconnaissance could obtain, insider knowledge of American military operations. The deserter networks established permanent infrastructure throughout South Vietnam and Cambodia. Safe houses in major cities where AWOL American troops could hide while establishing black market operations. Transportation networks that moved stolen weapons from American bases to NVA purchasing agents. Communication systems that coordinated sales between deserters and communist buyers. Some deserter operations became joint ventures between American and Vietnamese personnel. Sergeant Rodriguez partnered with Nguyen Van Minh, a former ARVN officer who'd switched sides in 1967. Together they operated the largest weapons trafficking organization in the Mekong Delta, moving millions of dollars worth of American military equipment to NVA forces. The scale of deserter operations shocked even experienced intelligence officers. Captain James Fletcher had been selling weapons for 6 months before military police discovered his operation included 12 other American soldiers and extended across 3 provinces. Fletcher's network had moved over 2,000 rifles, 50,000 rounds of ammunition, and classified maps showing American defensive positions. Military police units that should have stopped deserter operations instead protected them. MP Lieutenant David Walsh discovered that deserter networks provided the most reliable intelligence about NVA operations. Rather than arrest weapons traffickers, Walsh recruited them as informants, allowing continued weapon sales in exchange for information about communist activities. The corruption reached absurd levels when American and NVA officers began coordinating directly through deserter intermediaries. Captain Rodriguez would arrange meetings between American commanders willing to sell equipment and NVA purchasing agents with specific requirements. Former enemies became business partners in transactions that benefited everyone except the war effort. Some deserter operations outlasted the military units they'd originally served. Sergeant Michael Thompson established a weapons trafficking business in 1967 that continued operating through 1975. Thompson's network survived multiple American unit rotations, changes in command structure, and shifting military strategies. The business relationships proved more durable than military commitments. The psychological impact on American military morale was devastating. When soldiers discovered their comrades were profiting from weapon sales to the enemy, unit cohesion collapsed. Trust between officers and enlisted men evaporated. Military discipline became impossible to maintain when desertion offered better financial opportunities than service. Intelligence reports reaching Hanoi described deserter networks as North Vietnam's most reliable source of American military equipment. These weren't occasional transactions. They were systematic supply chains that delivered weapons more consistently than official military operations. Deserter networks had become institutionalized within the American military structure. Colonel Tin realized that American deserter operations represented something unprecedented in military history. The enemy was literally arming his forces while providing training, intelligence, and logistical support. American soldiers had become North Vietnam's most effective recruitment and supply officers. The deserter networks revealed a fundamental truth about American military capabilities that captured supplies couldn't show. The United States possessed such overwhelming material abundance that even systematic betrayal by its own forces couldn't significantly impact operational effectiveness. America was so wealthy it could afford to arm its enemies and still maintain military superiority. Standing among weapons sold by American deserters, Tin faced the most disturbing realization yet. The enemy was so powerful they could defeat themselves and still win. The captured American equipment didn't just shock Colonel Tin. It sent tremors through the highest levels of the Communist alliance. When Soviet military advisors examined the weapons and technology NVA forces had seized, their reports back to Moscow would fundamentally alter the Kremlin's assessment of American capabilities. Colonel Viktor Petrov had arrived in North Vietnam in 1967 as the Soviet Union's senior military advisor. A veteran of World War II and Korea, Petrov had spent decades analyzing American military equipment captured in various conflicts. He considered himself an expert on Western military technology. The equipment from those abandoned American bases would humble him completely. Petrov's first examination focused on the communications gear. Soviet military radios in 1968 were bulky, unreliable systems that barely functioned across regimental boundaries. The portable American radios could coordinate operations across continents. More disturbing, the frequency-hopping technology made American communications virtually impossible to intercept or jam. The technical specifications defied Soviet understanding of electronics manufacturing. American radio equipment weighed half as much as comparable Soviet systems while delivering 10 times the performance. The integrated circuits represented miniaturization technology that Soviet engineers had only theorized about in classified research papers. But the artillery guidance systems truly shocked Petrov. Soviet artillery in 1968 relied on manual calculations and visual observation for targeting. The captured American fire control computers could calculate firing solutions automatically, accounting for variables and Soviet artillerymen didn't even know existed. The accuracy differential wasn't measured in percentages. It was measured in orders of magnitude. Petrov's classified report to Moscow, dated March 15, 1968, contained language rarely seen in Soviet military communications. Respectfully recommend immediate reassessment of American technological capabilities. Current Soviet estimates appear fundamentally inadequate. The report acknowledged that the Soviet Union couldn't match American production capacity even at full wartime mobilization. The medical equipment analysis proved equally disturbing. Soviet military medicine lagged years behind American civilian standards, let alone American military capabilities. The portable surgical equipment found in routine American supply dumps exceeded anything available in Moscow's best hospitals. American field medics possessed better equipment than Soviet military surgeons. Moscow's response revealed the strategic implications. Premier Leonid Brezhnev ordered comprehensive reviews of Soviet military technology programs. Defense Minister Andrei Grechko initiated crash programs to develop Soviet equivalents to captured American systems. But internal assessments concluded that matching American capabilities would require decades and resources the Soviet economy couldn't provide. The psychological impact on Soviet advisors in Vietnam was profound. Colonel Petrov had spent his career believing Soviet military technology was roughly equivalent to American systems. The captured equipment revealed technological gaps so vast that conventional military thinking became irrelevant. Soviet advisors began recommending negotiated settlements rather than military victories. Major Alexei Volkov, Petrov's intelligence specialist, submitted reports that bordered on defeatist by Soviet standards. Volkov's analysis concluded that American forces in Vietnam were fighting with equipment generations ahead of anything in Soviet inventory. More disturbing, the manufacturing dates suggested American technology was advancing faster than Soviet research could track. The captured American equipment changed Soviet strategic planning throughout Southeast Asia. Moscow began pressuring North Vietnamese leadership to seek diplomatic solutions rather than military victories. Soviet advisors privately acknowledged that prolonged military confrontation with American technological superiority was unwinnable. The most damaging revelation came from examining American manufacturing capacity through captured logistics documents. Soviet intelligence had estimated American military production based on observed deployment patterns. The captured supply manifests revealed American production exceeded Soviet estimates by factors of 10 or more. The United States was producing military equipment faster than the Soviet Union could count it. Colonel Petrov's final report, submitted in April 1968, recommended fundamental changes to Soviet military doctrine. The report acknowledged that technological gaps between Soviet and American forces had become strategically decisive. Traditional numerical advantages couldn't overcome such overwhelming technological superiority. The Soviet advisors' shock rippled through communist military planning across multiple theaters. If American technological dominance was this pronounced in a limited conflict like Vietnam, what would full-scale confrontation look like? Moscow began reassessing global military commitments based on evidence from those abandoned American supply dumps. Standing among captured American equipment that his Soviet allies couldn't comprehend, Colonel Bui Tin realized he was fighting an enemy that had already defeated his most powerful ally without firing a shot. The technological demonstration was complete. But what Colonel Bui Tin and even Soviet advisors didn't realize was that American intelligence agencies were playing a far more sophisticated game with the captured supplies and black market weapons trafficking. The CIA had been orchestrating much of the corruption, using systematic weapons losses as the perfect cover for the most ambitious intelligence operation in agency history. James Angleton, the CIA's chief of counterintelligence, had recognized the opportunity in early 1967. Instead of stopping the black market weapons trade, why not control it? Every transaction could become an intelligence goldmine. Every corrupt American officer could become an unwitting asset. Every NVA purchasing agent could be tracked, monitored, and ultimately compromised. The operation, codenamed Supply Line, began with deliberate seeding of weapons into black market channels. CIA operatives would approach corrupt American quartermasters with attractive offers, sell specific equipment to predetermined buyers, and the agency would ensure no investigations followed. The quartermasters thought they were being protected. In reality, they were being recruited. Station Chief William Colby established a shadow network of CIA assets throughout South Vietnam's black market economy. Vietnamese translators who served as weapons brokers were actually agency informants. Corrupt military police officers protecting trafficking operations were secretly reporting to CIA handlers. American deserters selling weapons to NVA forces were unknowingly providing intelligence about communist supply needs and command structures. The sophistication of the operation was breathtaking. CIA technical specialists modified weapons before they entered black market channels, installing tracking devices and hidden transmitters. Every rifle sold to NVA forces became a beacon revealing communist positions. Every radio provided to enemy units allowed agency monitoring of communications. The weapons themselves became intelligence-gathering tools. But the CIA's most ambitious gambit involved deliberately compromised supply dumps. Agency operatives would identify American bases scheduled for evacuation, then ensure specific equipment was left behind for NVA forces to capture. The abandoned supplies weren't accidents. They were carefully orchestrated intelligence operations. The captured equipment served multiple purposes. CIA technical specialists had modified much of it to provide continuous intelligence about NVA operations. Hidden transmitters revealed enemy positions. Compromised communications equipment allowed monitoring of communist command structures. Even medical supplies contained tracking devices that mapped NVA medical facilities and casualty rates. More importantly, the captured equipment was designed to create psychological warfare effects. CIA analysts understood that overwhelming technological superiority could demoralize enemy forces more effectively than actual combat. The abandoned supplies were calculated to demonstrate American capabilities while demoralizing communist leadership about their chances of victory. The agency's most sophisticated operation involved recruiting NVA officers through the black market networks. Colonel Pham Van Duke, who had become wealthy facilitating weapons transactions between American and communist forces, was secretly providing intelligence to CIA handlers. His access to NVA purchasing decisions revealed communist operational priorities, supply shortages, and strategic planning. CIA operatives discovered that black market weapons trafficking provided unprecedented insight into enemy capabilities and intentions. Every purchase revealed communist tactical priorities. Requests for specific equipment types indicated planned operations. Changes in purchasing patterns suggested strategic shifts or supply problems within NVA command structures. The intelligence gathered through supply line operations influenced American military strategy throughout 1968. CIA reports based on black market transactions provided early warning of Tet offensive preparations. Analysis of communist purchasing patterns revealed NVA supply shortages that American forces could exploit. The weapons trafficking had become America's most valuable intelligence source. Station Chief Colby's reports to Washington describe Supply Line as the most successful intelligence operation in agency history. The systematic compromise of communist supply chains had provided strategic intelligence worth far more than the weapons lost to black market trafficking. The CIA was essentially trading equipment for information and winning the exchange decisively. But the most devastating aspect of the CIA's double game was psychological. Agency analysts understood that Colonel Bui Tin and other NVA commanders would eventually recognize the scale of American material superiority demonstrated by the captured supplies. The equipment was designed to demoralize communist leadership about their chances of military victory. The abandoned American supplies served as calculated demonstrations of overwhelming industrial capacity. CIA psychological warfare specialists had orchestrated the captures to maximize their impact on enemy morale. The weapons caches were designed to teach communist forces that they were fighting an unwinnable war against impossible odds. Standing among those captured American supplies, Colonel Bui Tin was experiencing exactly what CIA planners had intended: the crushing realization that North Vietnamese forces were fighting an enemy with virtually unlimited resources. The supplies weren't accidents, they were messages. And the message was clear: surrender now or face inevitable defeat against overwhelming American capabilities. The CIA's double game had succeeded beyond their wildest expectations. They'd turned systematic corruption into strategic advantage, transforming weapons losses into intelligence victories. But the captured supplies revealed something even more disturbing than advanced technology or CIA manipulation. They exposed an American industrial capacity that operated beyond the laws of economics as Colonel Bui Tin understood them. Captain Nguyen Van Thieu, Tin's logistics officer, had spent weeks analyzing captured American manufacturing documents. The numbers defied belief. Ford Motor Company was producing more military vehicles monthly than North Vietnam's entire transportation sector possessed. General Electric was manufacturing more radio equipment weekly than Soviet factories produced annually. American industrial output wasn't just superior, it was operating in a different economic universe. The manufacturing dates on captured equipment told an impossible story. Artillery shells produced in January were being used in combat by February. Rifles, manufactured in Detroit, were reaching Vietnamese battlefields within weeks. The American industrial machine was producing finished military equipment faster than most armies could deploy it. Teo's analysis revealed the scope of American manufacturing dedicated to Vietnam operations. Boeing was producing transport aircraft specifically for Southeast Asian operations, while simultaneously manufacturing commercial airliners for civilian markets. General Motors was building military trucks for Vietnam while expanding civilian automobile production. American industry was fighting a war without reducing civilian economic output. The captured supply manifests showed routine replacement schedules that boggled Vietnamese understanding. American forces expected complete equipment replacement every 6 months. Weapons were discarded and replaced based on maintenance schedules, not combat losses. The Americans were treating military equipment like consumable supplies. More disturbing were the production capacity reports found in captured logistics documents. American ammunition factories were operating at 60% capacity while producing more explosives monthly than North Vietnam used annually. The United States was fighting the Vietnam War with industrial surplus, not maximum production effort. Colonel Tin studied captured American industrial surveys that revealed manufacturing capabilities beyond imagination. Chrysler Corporation alone possessed more machine tools than North Vietnam's entire industrial base. Single American factories employed more workers than entire North Vietnamese provinces. The scale of American manufacturing made communist industrial planning look like cottage industry. The psychological impact was devastating. North Vietnamese leadership had built strategy around the assumption that prolonged war would exhaust American industrial capacity. The captured documents revealed Americans were barely utilizing their manufacturing potential. They could increase production tenfold without straining their industrial base. Intelligence reports from Hanoi confirm the pattern across multiple American industries. DuPont was producing military explosives while expanding civilian chemical operations. Westinghouse was manufacturing military electronics while growing consumer appliance production. American corporations were profiting from war production while expanding civilian markets simultaneously. The most shocking revelation came from examining American steel production figures found in captured planning documents. American steel mills were producing more metal monthly than the Soviet Union and North Vietnam combined. Single American corporations possessed more industrial capacity than entire communist nations. Tin realized the fundamental assumption underlying communist strategy was catastrophically wrong. They'd believed American capitalism would eventually buckle under war costs. The captured evidence showed American industry was profiting from war production while maintaining economic growth. The war was stimulating American industrial expansion, not constraining it. The manufacturing analysis revealed why Americans could abandon so much equipment casually. Replacement costs were negligible compared to total industrial output. Losing a supply depot worth millions represented hours of American production time. Equipment that took North Vietnamese factories months to produce could be replaced by American industry within days. Standing among mountains of American equipment that represented mere hours of enemy production capacity, Colonel Tin faced the most sobering realization of his military career. North Vietnamese forces weren't fighting American military capabilities. They were fighting American industrial surplus. The enemy possessed manufacturing capacity so vast that military losses became statistically insignificant. The captured documents revealed American industry was producing war materials faster than any army could possibly consume them. More terrifying, they were doing it while simultaneously expanding civilian production, developing new technologies, and maintaining global economic dominance. Tin understood now why Soviet advisors were recommending negotiated settlements. The communist world was fighting an enemy that could manufacture victory faster than anyone could achieve it militarily. American industry had made conventional warfare obsolete through sheer production superiority. The mathematics were inescapable. They were fighting an enemy that could literally manufacture their way to victory. But the most devastating revelation about American capabilities came from a discovery that would haunt Colonel Bui Tin for the rest of his life. Hidden in the administrative files of the abandoned firebase were helicopter maintenance schedules that revealed the true scope of American air mobility. Captain Pham Van Duke, Tin's intelligence officer, had been analyzing captured flight logs when he stumbled upon documents that defied comprehension. Firebase. Charlie alone maintained operational schedules for 847 helicopters. Not total. American helicopters in Vietnam. Helicopters assigned to one medium-sized base. The maintenance logs revealed aircraft rotation patterns that boggled Vietnamese understanding. Individual helicopters flew multiple missions daily across hundreds of miles. Crew rotations operated around the clock. Fuel consumption figures showed single bases using more aviation fuel weekly than North Vietnam's entire Air Force consumed annually. Duke's analysis revealed the tactical implications that made traditional Vietnamese military doctrine obsolete. American forces could redeploy entire divisions within hours using helicopter transport. Troop movements that took NVA forces months of careful planning could be accomplished by Americans during lunch breaks. The psychological impact was crushing. Tin's forces moved on foot through jungle terrain, carrying supplies on their backs, planning operations around the physical limitations of human endurance. American forces moved by air, carrying unlimited supplies, planning operations around the speed of helicopter transport. Captured flight schedules showed routine operations that exceeded Vietnamese imagination. Daily supply runs to remote outposts. Casualty evacuations from anywhere in South Vietnam within minutes. Troop insertions that could place American forces behind NVA positions no faster than communist forces could retreat. The mathematics were sobering. American helicopter capacity could move Tin's entire division in a single day. The same transport capability that took North Vietnamese forces weeks of dangerous jungle marching could be accomplished by Americans in hours of routine flight operations. More disturbing were the logistics support requirements revealed in the maintenance documents. Each helicopter required teams of mechanics, constant fuel supplies, regular parts replacement, and sophisticated communication networks. The support infrastructure for American air mobility exceeded the total capacity of most national militaries. Tin studied captured pilot rotation schedules that showed the human resources dedicated to helicopter operations. Thousands of trained pilots, mechanics, and support personnel assigned to single bases. The Americans had more helicopter crews at Firebase Charlie than North Vietnam possessed total aircraft personnel. The captured documents revealed helicopter production schedules that made Vietnamese aircraft manufacturing look primitive. Bell Helicopter was delivering new aircraft to Vietnam faster than North Vietnamese forces could shoot them down. American helicopter production exceeded communist destruction rates by factors of 10 or more. Intelligence reports from other NVA commanders confirmed the pattern across South Vietnam. Every American base maintained helicopter fleets that dwarfed entire national air forces. The cumulative American air mobility capacity represented more aircraft than most countries possessed in total. Tin realized the fundamental tactical advantage that made American forces nearly invincible. While NVA units planned operations around walking speeds and supply limitations, American forces planned around helicopter mobility and unlimited logistics support. The Americans could respond to any NVA initiative faster than communist forces could execute it. The helicopter revelation explained why American forces seemed omnipresent, despite relatively small troop numbers. Air mobility allowed Americans to concentrate overwhelming force at any point within hours. NVA forces could never achieve surprise because Americans could redeploy faster than communists could attack. Standing among captured maintenance logs that documented more aircraft than his entire nation possessed, Colonel Bui Tin faced the most tactically devastating realization of the war. North Vietnamese forces weren't fighting American ground troops, they were fighting an enemy that had eliminated geography as a tactical factor. The Americans had achieved something unprecedented in military history. They'd made distance irrelevant through air mobility. Every Vietnamese tactical advantage based on terrain, positioning, or logistics superiority became meaningless against an enemy that could fly anywhere instantly. Tin understood now why traditional guerrilla warfare was failing against American forces. The tactics that had worked against the French assumed enemies limited by ground transportation. Americans fought from the sky, but the helicopter revelation was only preparation for what Colonel Bui Tin would discover next. Hidden among the captured American equipment were artillery pieces that would redefine his understanding of modern warfare itself. Lieutenant Colonel Vo Van Kit, Tin's artillery specialist, had examined captured guns from French forces at Dien Bien Phu. He'd studied Soviet artillery systems throughout his career. He'd analyzed ARVN equipment seized in countless engagements. Nothing had prepared him for the American M109 self-propelled howitzers abandoned at Firebase Charlie. The first shock was the fire control computer mounted inside each artillery piece. Soviet artillery in 1968 relied on manual calculations, slide rules, and experienced gunners making educated guesses about wind speed and target distance. The American system calculated firing solutions automatically, accounting for variables Vietnamese artillerymen didn't even know existed. Kiet discovered the computers could adjust for atmospheric pressure, humidity levels, temperature variations, and even the rotation of the Earth. The targeting precision wasn't measured in city blocks, it was measured in meters. American artillery could hit specific buildings from distances that made visual observation impossible. The captured fire mission logs revealed tactical capabilities that defied Vietnamese understanding of artillery warfare. American guns could strike targets anywhere in South Vietnam from fixed positions. The range and accuracy made traditional concepts of safe distance obsolete. There was nowhere in the country that American artillery couldn't reach with precision strikes, but the most devastating discovery was the integrated targeting network. The captured communications equipment revealed that American artillery batteries were linked electronically across the entire theater. A single forward observer could call in fire support from dozens of artillery positions simultaneously. The Americans had created an artillery system that functioned like a single massive weapon. Kit's analysis of captured ammunition revealed technology that seemed impossible. Artillery shells with primitive guidance systems that could adjust trajectory after firing. Proximity fuses that detonated at optimal distances for maximum effectiveness. Specialized rounds designed for specific target types, bunker busters, anti-personnel, area denial weapons. The psychological impact on Vietnamese artillery doctrine was complete. NVA artillery tactics assumed rough parity between opposing gun systems. Superior positioning could overcome superior equipment. Better tactics could defeat better weapons. The American artillery made such assumptions suicidal. Traditional Vietnamese defensive positions became death traps against American precision fire. Bunkers that had protected against French artillery became target practice for American computer-guided guns. Trenches that had provided safety became precisely targeted killing zones. The Americans had eliminated cover as a tactical concept. Intelligence reports from other NVA commanders painted the same picture across South Vietnam. American artillery could coordinate fires across multiple provinces simultaneously. Single forward observers could direct devastating barrages from artillery positions hundreds of miles away. The firepower coordination exceeded anything in military history. The captured maintenance logs revealed the industrial support required for such precision. Each artillery piece required constant technical maintenance, regular computer updates, and specialized ammunition that cost more per shell than most armies spent on entire battles. The Americans were fighting with equipment that required industrial civilization to operate. Tin realized the tactical implications that made traditional military planning obsolete. Vietnamese forces could no longer mass for major operations because American artillery could destroy concentrations instantly. They couldn't establish fixed positions because precision fire made fortifications useless. They couldn't coordinate large unit movements because American observers could call in devastating fires anywhere. The artillery revelation explained why American forces seemed so confident in their defensive positions. They weren't relying on local firepower. They were backed by integrated artillery networks that could deliver overwhelming fires within minutes. Every American position was protected by the entire theater artillery system. Standing among captured American artillery pieces that could hit targets with surgical precision from impossible distances, Colonel Bui Tin faced another devastating realization. North Vietnamese forces weren't fighting American artillery. They were fighting an integrated fire support system that had made traditional warfare obsolete. The Americans had achieved something unprecedented. They'd eliminated the fog of war through technology. Their artillery didn't miss because it couldn't miss. The computers, communications, and precision guidance had created weapons that made human error irrelevant. Tin understood now why massed infantry attacks were failing so catastrophically against American positions. Vietnamese tactics assumed artillery that missed most of the time. American artillery never missed. But perhaps the most morally devastating discovery among the captured American supplies wasn't weapons or technology. It was the medical equipment that revealed just how much human suffering the technological gap was causing. Major Tran Van Min, Colonel Bui Tin's chief medical officer, had operated battlefield hospitals throughout the war using improvised equipment and herbal remedies. He'd performed surgery with kitchen knives sterilized over campfires. He'd treated infections with traditional medicines when antibiotics weren't available. He'd watched soldiers die from wounds that should have been survivable. Walking through the abandoned American medical depot was like entering a different century. Portable X-ray machines that could diagnose injuries instantly. Surgical instruments so precise they made scalpels look like farming tools. Anesthesia equipment that could eliminate pain completely during operations. Medical technology that belonged in science fiction, not battlefield hospitals. The antibiotics alone represented a fortune beyond Vietnamese comprehension. Penicillin, streptomycin, and experimental drugs that didn't exist in civilian medicine. Single bottles of American antibiotics could save hundreds of North Vietnamese soldiers dying from infections. The Americans had abandoned enough medical supplies to operate every hospital in North Vietnam for years. Min discovered surgical equipment he'd only read about in medical textbooks from before the war. Microsurgery instruments that could reattach severed limbs, cardiac monitors that could detect heart problems before symptoms appeared, blood plasma substitutes that could treat massive hemorrhaging when transfusions weren't possible. The psychological impact was crushing. Min calculated that the abandoned medical supplies could have prevented thousands of deaths in North Vietnamese hospitals. Soldiers who died from treatable infections. Civilians who'd succumbed to diseases that American medicine could cure routinely. The medical gap wasn't just technological, it was moral. More disturbing were the experimental drugs found throughout the medical supplies. Pain medications more effective than morphine without addiction risks. Blood clotting agents that could stop hemorrhaging instantly. Antibiotics that could treat infections considered incurable by Vietnamese medical standards. The Americans were fighting with medical technology decades ahead of anything available to their enemies. The captured medical inventory revealed routine waste that boggled Vietnamese understanding. Surgical instruments used once and discarded. Antibiotics with expiration dates thrown away while still effective. Medical equipment abandoned because newer models had arrived. Americans were discarding medical miracles like garbage. Min studied captured American medical protocols that showed treatment standards impossible in Vietnamese facilities. Every American soldier received medical care superior to what North Vietnamese generals could access. Routine. American battlefield medicine exceeded the capabilities of Hanoi's best hospitals. The moral implications were staggering. American forces possessed medical technology that could save Vietnamese lives, but were using it exclusively for their own troops. The medical supplies abandoned at Firebase. Charlie could have treated every wounded NVA soldier in Tin's division. Instead, they'd been left to rot in jungle humidity. Intelligence reports from other captured medical facilities confirmed the pattern across South Vietnam. American medical capabilities were so advanced that battlefield injuries considered fatal by Vietnamese standards were treated routinely. American soldiers survived wounds that would kill Vietnamese troops not because of superior courage, but because of superior medicine. The captured medical equipment revealed the true cost of the technological gap. Vietnamese soldiers weren't just fighting with inferior weapons, they were dying from treatable conditions while their enemies possessed medical miracles. The war wasn't just militarily unequal, it was medically genocidal. Standing among medical supplies worth more than North Vietnam's entire healthcare budget, Major Min faced the most morally devastating realization of his career. They weren't just fighting an enemy with superior firepower, they were fighting an enemy who could save lives they couldn't. The Americans possessed the technology to heal, but were using their medical superiority as another weapon of war. The abandoned medical supplies weren't just evidence of American abundance. They were monuments to Vietnamese suffering that could have been prevented. For Colonel Bui Tin, the medical revelation completed his education about American capabilities. They weren't just militarily superior. They were medically, technologically, and industrially operating in a different universe entirely. But the most strategically devastating discovery among the captured American equipment wasn't weapons or medical supplies. It was the communications gear that would give Colonel Bui Tin an unfiltered window into the American military mind. Senior Captain Levan Duke, Tin's communications specialist, had spent years trying to intercept American radio transmissions using primitive Soviet equipment. The best they could manage were occasional fragments of coded messages that revealed little useful intelligence. The captured American radio systems would change everything. The first breakthrough came when Duke discovered the Americans weren't just using superior radio equipment, they were operating multiple communication networks simultaneously. Military command frequencies, logistics coordination channels, air support networks, and medical evacuation systems all functioned independently. The Americans had more communication capacity in a single base than North Vietnam possessed nationally. But the real intelligence goldmine emerged when Duke realized the captured radios were still receiving American transmissions. The frequency hopping technology that made American communications impossible to intercept actually worked in reverse. Captured American equipment could monitor all American frequencies automatically. Within hours, Tin's intelligence team was listening to conversations that revealed the entire structure of American operations in South Vietnam. Casual radio chatter between helicopter pilots discussing mission schedules, artillery coordinators planning fire support operations, supply officers arranging equipment deliveries. The Americans were broadcasting their complete operational picture in real time. The psychological impact was profound. Vietnamese forces had operated in intelligence darkness throughout the war, never knowing American capabilities or intentions until attacks began. Suddenly, they were listening to American commanders discussing Vietnamese operations with casual confidence, often knowing NVA plans before Vietnamese troops received orders. The intercepted conversations revealed American operational tempo that defied Vietnamese understanding. Commanders coordinating simultaneous operations across multiple provinces, pilots discussing mission schedules that involved hundreds of aircraft daily, Supply officers managing logistics networks that moved more materials hourly than Vietnamese forces transported monthly. More disturbing was the tone of American communications. Officers discussed Vietnamese resistance like minor inconveniences rather than serious military threats. Pilots joked about target practice while describing attacks on NVA positions. Commanders spoke about Vietnamese casualties with a detachment of accountants discussing inventory losses. Duke discovered the Americans were intercepting Vietnamese communications with equal ease. Radio conversations revealed detailed knowledge of NVA troop movements, supply schedules, and operational plans. The Americans weren't just technologically superior, they were operationally omniscient compared to Vietnamese intelligence capabilities. The captured communications equipment revealed coordination networks that operated like science fiction. American commanders could coordinate with artillery batteries, air support, naval forces, and logistics networks simultaneously. Single radio operators possessed more communication capability than entire Vietnamese command structures. Intelligence reports from intercepted American transmissions painted a picture of overwhelming operational superiority. American forces could coordinate responses to Vietnamese initiatives faster than communist forces could execute them. The communication advantage made American forces effectively prescient about Vietnamese operations. The most devastating discovery came from monitoring American casualty evacuation networks. Medical helicopters could reach wounded Americans anywhere in South Vietnam within minutes. The coordination between combat units, medical facilities, and transport aircraft operated with mechanical precision. Americans didn't just possess superior medical technology, they could deliver it instantly anywhere. Tin realized the intercepted communications revealed why American forces seemed so confident despite relatively small numbers. They weren't fighting as isolated units. They were fighting as components of an integrated system that could concentrate overwhelming force anywhere within hours. The communication networks had made American forces collectively invincible even when individually vulnerable. Standing among captured American radio equipment that provided real-time intelligence about enemy operations, Colonel Bui Tin faced another crushing realization. Vietnamese forces weren't just fighting American troops. They were fighting an enemy that could see everything, coordinate everything, and respond to everything faster than Vietnamese forces could act. The radio intelligence goldmine had revealed the final piece of American military superiority. They didn't just possess better weapons, technology, and supplies. They possessed perfect information about Vietnamese operations while maintaining complete secrecy about their own capabilities. The Americans had achieved something unprecedented in military history. They'd eliminated uncertainty as a factor in warfare through superior communications. They knew everything while revealing nothing. But the captured American communications equipment had revealed something even more impossible than superior technology or perfect intelligence. It had exposed a logistics system that operated beyond the laws of physics as Colonel Bui Tin understood them. Captain Nguyen Van Thieu had been monitoring American supply coordination frequencies for 3 days when he stumbled upon conversations that made him question his own sanity. American supply officers were discussing ice cream deliveries to jungle fire bases. Not medical supplies or ammunition, ice cream. Fresh, frozen ice cream delivered daily to combat positions that Vietnamese forces couldn't reach with basic food supplies. The logistics coordination revealed operational capabilities that defied Vietnamese understanding of military supply chains. American forces in remote jungle positions received hot meals delivered by helicopter twice daily. Fresh vegetables flown in from Saigon markets, Coca-Cola and beer delivered to forward operating bases that NVA forces considered inaccessible wilderness. Thieu's analysis of intercepted supply conversations revealed the casual abundance that made American military operations possible. Individual American soldiers consumed more food daily than Vietnamese families received weekly. Single American bases discarded more supplies daily than NVA regional commands possessed in total. The Americans were fighting a war of abundance, while Vietnamese forces fought a war of scarcity. The psychological impact was devastating. Vietnamese soldiers carried rice and dried fish for weeks-long operations, carefully rationing every grain to avoid starvation. American soldiers complained about menu variety while consuming fresh steaks and ice cream in jungle combat zones. The supply disparity wasn't just quantitative, it was qualitatively impossible. More disturbing were the casual waste patterns revealed through intercepted logistics communications. American supply officers discussing disposal of excess equipment because storage space was limited. Perfectly functional weapons destroyed rather than transported because newer models had arrived. Food supplies thrown away because expiration dates were approaching, not because they were spoiled. The captured supply manifests showed delivery schedules that operated like commercial businesses rather than military operations. Daily helicopter flights delivering newspapers and mail to remote outposts. Weekly shipments of recreational equipment, footballs, playing cards, musical instruments, to combat positions. Monthly deliveries of luxury items that most Vietnamese civilians had never seen. Tin realized the Americans had eliminated logistics as a limiting factor in military operations. While Vietnamese forces planned operations around supply availability, American forces planned around operational objectives, knowing supplies would appear automatically. The logistics superiority made American tactical flexibility unlimited. The intercepted communications revealed supply networks that operated across global distances with mechanical precision. Equipment manufactured in Detroit arrived at Vietnamese fire bases within weeks. Spare parts ordered from California were delivered to jungle maintenance facilities faster than Vietnamese forces could move supplies between provinces. Intelligence reports from other NVA commanders confirmed the pattern throughout South Vietnam. American forces consumed supplies at rates that exceeded Vietnamese production capacity by orders of magnitude. Single American meals contained more protein than Vietnamese soldiers received monthly. Individual American soldiers carried more equipment than entire Vietnamese squads possessed. The most psychologically crushing discovery was the casual attitude American soldiers displayed toward their material abundance. Intercepted conversations revealed troops complaining about food quality while consuming meals superior to anything available in North Vietnamese cities. Soldiers discarding equipment casually that Vietnamese forces would consider priceless treasures. Thieu calculated that American forces discarded more usable equipment weekly than North Vietnamese factories produced annually. The waste streams from American operations contained more military value than most national armies possessed intentionally. Americans were literally throwing away more resources than their enemies could acquire through maximum effort. The logistics revelation explained why American morale remained high despite combat losses. Soldiers who never experienced material deprivation couldn't understand the desperation that motivated Vietnamese resistance. Americans were fighting a comfortable war while Vietnamese forces fought for survival. Standing among evidence of American logistics capabilities that delivered luxury items to jungle combat zones, Colonel Bui Tin faced the most psychologically devastating realization yet. North Vietnamese forces weren't fighting American military logistics. They were fighting American consumer abundance applied to warfare. The Americans had achieved something unprecedented in military history. They'd eliminated scarcity as a factor in combat operations. Their soldiers fought knowing that every material need would be satisfied instantly, while Vietnamese forces fought knowing that every supply shortage could mean death. The logistics that defied physics had revealed the final truth about American power. They possessed abundance so vast that warfare became a consumer experience rather than a survival struggle. But the most personally devastating education about American capabilities came from an unexpected source. American prisoners of war who revealed truths about their homeland that shattered Colonel Bui Tin's remaining illusions about the nature of the conflict. Captain William Henderson, had been shot down over North Vietnam in March 1968, 3 weeks after the Firebase Charlie discoveries. During interrogation at the prison camp near Hanoi, Henderson provided information that disturbed Tin more than any captured equipment or intercepted communications. Henderson wasn't boasting about American military might. He was complaining about it. The pilot described American military bases he'd never heard of, scattered across South Vietnam like industrial cities. Cam Ranh Bay, he explained casually, processed more cargo daily than the port of Haiphong handled monthly. Henderson mentioned this as a minor detail while discussing flight schedules. The psychological impact was immediate. Vietnamese intelligence had identified major American installations through painstaking reconnaissance and captured documents. Henderson was describing dozens of additional bases that NVA forces didn't even know existed. The Americans possessed military infrastructure so vast that their own personnel couldn't track it completely. More disturbing was Henderson's attitude toward the war itself. He expressed frustration not about Vietnamese resistance, but about American public opinion back home. The war was unpopular, he explained, not because Americans couldn't win, but because they were bored with winning so easily. Henderson described anti-war protests as entertainment rather than serious political opposition. Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, captured during a black market weapons transaction, provided even more sobering intelligence. Rodriguez had been selling military equipment to NVA forces for months, but his interrogation revealed the true scale of American military abundance. The weapons he'd been trafficking represented less than daily waste from single American bases. Rodriguez described American military waste with casual indifference that shocked Vietnamese interrogators. Entire warehouses of equipment abandoned because units were rotating home. Perfectly functional weapons destroyed rather than transported because replacement costs were cheaper than shipping expenses. Military abundance so vast that systematic theft barely registered as inventory shrinkage. The captured Americans revealed something more devastating than superior technology or logistics. They revealed American public indifference to war costs that Vietnamese leadership couldn't comprehend. Lieutenant James Walsh explained that most Americans barely knew the Vietnam War was happening. Television coverage was limited to brief evening news segments. Daily life in America continued normally while their military fought globally. This revelation struck at the heart of North Vietnamese strategy. Communist leadership had built their entire approach around the assumption that prolonged war would exhaust American public support. The POW testimonies revealed that Americans weren't being asked to sacrifice anything meaningful for the war effort. They were fighting Vietnam while simultaneously expanding their civilian economy. Captain Henderson described American military production as routine business operations rather than wartime mobilization. Boeing was building military transport aircraft for Vietnam while expanding commercial airline production. General Motors was manufacturing military vehicles while increasing civilian automobile sales. American corporations were profiting from war production without reducing consumer goods availability. The POW interviews revealed the casual confidence that characterized American military thinking. These weren't desperate soldiers fighting for survival. They were professionals completing assignments in a conflict they considered militarily insignificant. Henderson described Vietnam operations as training exercises compared to American capabilities for global warfare. Most devastating was the prisoners' genuine surprise at Vietnamese military capabilities. They'd expected to face primitive guerrilla forces using World War II equipment. The discovery that NVA forces possessed sophisticated weapons and tactics impressed them as curiosities rather than serious threats to American military superiority. Standing in that prison camp, listening to captured Americans describe their homeland's casual approach to a war that consumed every resource North Vietnam possessed, Colonel Bui Tin faced his final education about the enemy he was fighting. The Americans weren't even trying their hardest. The POW discoveries completed Tin's understanding of the impossible odds facing Vietnamese resistance. They were fighting an enemy so powerful that Vietnam represented a minor training exercise rather than a serious military commitment. The accumulated weight of evidence from captured supplies, intercepted communications, and prisoner interrogations finally broke through Colonel Bui Tin's ideological conditioning in April 1968. Sitting in his command bunker north of the DMZ, surrounded by intelligence reports that painted an impossible picture of American capabilities, Tin made the most dangerous decision of his career. He would tell his superiors the truth. His classified report to North Vietnamese High Command, dated April 23, 1968, contained language that bordered on treason by party standards. Respectfully submit that current strategic assumptions require immediate reassessment, Tin wrote. American material superiority exceeds previous estimates by orders of magnitude. Military victory through prolonged resistance may not be achievable given demonstrated enemy capabilities. The response from Hanoi was swift and brutal. General Vo Nguyen Giap himself summoned Tin to defend his defeatist analysis. The meeting, held in a secure bunker beneath Hanoi, would determine whether Tin faced court-martial or continued command. Giap's opening words left no doubt about the stakes. Explain why you've lost faith in the people's struggle. Tin's presentation lasted 4 hours. He displayed captured American equipment, read intercepted communications transcripts, and presented mathematical analyses of enemy production capacity. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and strategically catastrophic. American forces weren't just superior. They were operating with capabilities that made traditional military resistance futile. The silence that followed Tin's briefing stretched for minutes. Senior party officials who'd built careers on promises of inevitable victory faced evidence that their fundamental assumptions were wrong. The Americans weren't weakening under prolonged resistance. They were barely utilizing their full capabilities while fighting multiple global commitments simultaneously. General Giap's response revealed the internal communist debate that would reshape North Vietnamese strategy. If military victory is impossible, Giap asked quietly, what alternatives remain? The question acknowledged what party ideology had forbidden. American military superiority was so overwhelming that conventional resistance was suicidal. The strategic shift began immediately, though it would never be acknowledged publicly. North Vietnamese leadership began emphasizing political warfare over military operations. The focus changed from defeating American forces to defeating American public opinion. If they couldn't win militarily, perhaps they could win psychologically. Tin's career survived, but his reputation within party circles was permanently damaged. He'd committed the ultimate heresy. He told uncomfortable truths that contradicted official optimism. His subsequent assignments kept him away from strategic planning, relegated to tactical operations where his defeatist analysis couldn't influence policy. The personal cost was devastating. Tin had spent his adult life believing that superior will could overcome material disadvantage. The captured American supplies had taught him that industrial capacity ultimately determined military outcomes regardless of ideological commitment. The lesson was correct, but professionally suicidal. Other NVA commanders who'd reached similar conclusions learned to keep their assessments private. Colonel Pham Van Duke submitted reports that acknowledged American material superiority while maintaining optimistic conclusions about ultimate victory. The system rewarded comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. The strategic shift toward political warfare would define the remainder of the Vietnam conflict. North Vietnamese leadership abandoned hopes of military victory in favor of psychological warfare aimed at American public opinion. The Tet Offensive had failed militarily, but succeeded politically by demonstrating that the war would continue indefinitely. But the shift came too late to save hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese lives. Military operations continued despite leadership's private acknowledgement that they were unwinnable. Soldiers died implementing tactics that commanders knew were futile, sacrificed to maintain political fiction about inevitable victory. Standing in his bunker, reading reports about continued military operations that he knew were hopeless, Colonel Bui Tin faced the most morally devastating realization of his career. The captured American supplies had revealed not just enemy capabilities, but the fundamental dishonesty of his own leadership. They were sending men to die in a war they privately knew was unwinnable. The strategic shift had begun, but the killing would continue for 7 more years, while politicians on both sides pursued face-saving measures that preserved their careers while destroying lives. But the most insidious revelation from Colonel Bui Tin's intelligence gathering wasn't about American military capabilities. It was about how systematic corruption had transformed the Vietnam War into the most profitable business venture in military history. By late 1968, the black market weapons trade that had begun as opportunistic theft had evolved into institutionalized commerce that operated with the efficiency of multinational corporations. American and NVA officers weren't just tolerating corruption. They were actively partnering in business ventures that made official military operations secondary to personal enrichment. Captain Robert Mitchell, a U.S. Army quartermaster at Long Binh, had established what amounted to a military equipment franchise operation. Mitchell's network included corrupt South Vietnamese officials, NVA purchasing agents, and American deserters who served as armed security for weapons convoys. The operation moved more military equipment monthly than many official supply chains. The sophistication was breathtaking. Mitchell's organization maintained warehouses in neutral zones where American and communist forces conducted business transactions under unofficial truces. NVA officers would arrive with cash payments while American personnel delivered weapons, ammunition, and medical supplies. The transactions occurred with the formality of legitimate business meetings. Colonel Nguyen Van Duc, Tin's former logistics officer, had become wealthy facilitating these arrangements. Duc maintained bank accounts in Switzerland, where American and Vietnamese officers deposited profits from joint weapons trafficking operations. The war had created millionaires on both sides who had more in common with each other than with the soldiers they were supposed to be commanding. The corruption networks operated with their own intelligence services, security forces, and diplomatic protocols. Corrupt American MPs protected trafficking operations from military investigators. Vietnamese communist officials provided safe passage for weapons convoys through territory they officially controlled. The shadow economy had developed its own military structure parallel to official forces. More disturbing was how the corruption influenced actual combat operations. American units would stage fake ambushes to explain missing equipment while splitting profits with the NVA forces who officially captured the supplies. Vietnamese commanders would deliberately avoid attacking American positions to protect profitable business relationships. The war itself had become theater performed around commercial transactions. The psychological impact on both militaries was devastating. Soldiers on both sides discovered their officers were profiting from prolonging a conflict that killed subordinates for business purposes. American troops realized their equipment shortages resulted from systematic theft by their own commanders. Vietnamese fighters learned their leaders were selling weapons to the enemy while demanding greater sacrifices from rank-and-file soldiers. Intelligence reports revealed corruption networks that spanned the entire theater of operations. Joint American-Vietnamese trafficking organizations operated from Cambodia to the DMZ. Corrupt officials had established permanent business relationships that transcended national loyalties or ideological commitments. The profit motive had created a third army that served neither American nor Vietnamese interests. The most cynical aspect was how corruption networks actively worked to prolong the conflict. Peace would eliminate the business opportunities that had made participants wealthy. American and Vietnamese officers who'd become millionaires through weapons trafficking had financial incentives to prevent military victories that would end their profitable operations. Standing among evidence of systematic corruption that had transformed warfare into commerce, Colonel Bui Tin faced perhaps his most disillusioning discovery. The captured American supplies hadn't just revealed enemy capabilities, they'd exposed how greed had corrupted both sides so thoroughly that the war's official purposes had become irrelevant to its actual conduct. The corruption had spread so extensively that distinguishing between legitimate military operations and criminal enterprises became impossible. Officers on both sides were simultaneously fighting and profiting from the same conflict, creating perverse incentives that made victory less profitable than continued warfare. Tin realized the final truth about the Vietnam War. It had evolved beyond political or military conflict into a business enterprise that served the financial interests of corrupt participants while sacrificing the lives of honest soldiers who still believed they were fighting for meaningful causes. The war would continue not because either side could win, but because too many people on both sides were profiting from its continuation. 23 years after the fall of Saigon, Colonel Bui Tin sat in his modest apartment in Paris, exile having followed his eventual defection from the Communist Party in 1990. The captured American supplies from Firebase Charlie remained vivid in his memory, not as military intelligence, but as the moment he'd first glimpsed the true nature of modern power. The notebooks he'd kept throughout the war, smuggled out during his defection, contained calculations that had proven prophetic with devastating accuracy. His analysis of American industrial capacity, written in 1968, had predicted the war's outcome with mathematical precision. The numbers hadn't lied. They'd simply been too uncomfortable for anyone to believe. Tin's post-war government career had been shaped entirely by the lessons learned from those captured supplies. As Deputy Minister of Information in the 1980s, he'd advocated for economic reforms based on his understanding of American industrial capabilities. Vietnam couldn't compete militarily with such capacity, but perhaps it could compete economically by learning from American organizational methods. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same material abundance that had made American military victory inevitable could potentially lift Vietnam from post-war poverty, if communist leadership could abandon ideological rigidity in favor of practical economics. The captured supplies had taught him that material conditions ultimately determined political outcomes, not the reverse. His memoirs, published after defection, contained passages that Vietnamese censors had forbidden for decades. "We fought America's surplus production, not America itself," he wrote. The abandoned supplies at Firebase Charlie represented hours of American manufacturing time, while similar equipment would have required months of Vietnamese industrial effort to produce. The personal cost of recognizing these truths had been enormous. Tin's military career had stagnated after his 1968 report to high command. His political advancement had been limited by his reputation for excessive realism about American capabilities. Speaking uncomfortable truths had made him professionally radioactive within party circles that preferred comfortable delusions. But the captured American supplies had taught him something more valuable than career advancement. They'd revealed how industrial capacity created political possibilities. Nations that could manufacture abundance could afford democratic governance, social welfare, and individual freedoms. Nations trapped in scarcity inevitably produced authoritarian systems that rationed everything, including truth. The lesson had taken decades to fully understand. American democracy wasn't the cause of American prosperity. It was the result. Political freedom became possible only when material abundance eliminated zero-sum competition for basic necessities. The captured supplies had shown him a society so wealthy that political disagreement became entertainment rather than existential struggle. Standing in that abandoned American firebase in 1968, examining equipment worth more than entire Vietnamese provinces, Tin had witnessed the future of global power. Nations that mastered industrial production would dominate those that relied on ideology, courage, or military tradition. The material world ultimately determined the political world, regardless of human preferences or beliefs. His final assessment, written in exile, contained the most honest evaluation of the Vietnam War ever produced by a senior communist official. "We won because Americans chose to leave, not because we forced them out. The captured supplies proved they possessed unlimited capacity to continue fighting. Their departure represented political decision, not military necessity. The captured American supplies had revealed the fundamental truth about modern warfare that political leaders on both sides had refused to acknowledge. Industrial capacity, not military tactics or ideological commitment, determined outcomes in conflicts between developed nations. Everything else was theater performed around this central reality." Sitting in his Paris apartment, reading news reports about America's continued global dominance 30 years after Vietnam, Colonel Bui Tin understood that the lesson of Firebase, Charlie, remained relevant. The nation that could manufacture the most abundance would ultimately shape the world's political future, regardless of temporary military setbacks or political embarrassments. The supplies that had changed everything weren't just evidence of American military capability, they were glimpses of humanity's industrial future, where material abundance would eventually make traditional warfare obsolete through sheer productive superiority. The black market networks that Colonel Bui Tin had witnessed during the Vietnam War didn't disappear when Saigon fell in 1975. They evolved into permanent criminal enterprises that would influence global conflicts for decades to come. The corruption patterns established during Vietnam became templates for weapons trafficking in subsequent American military interventions. The same organizational structures that had moved American equipment to NVA forces reappeared in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. Corrupt military personnel, local intermediaries, and insurgent purchasing agents recreated the profitable relationships that had flourished in Southeast Asia. Captain Robert Mitchell, the corrupt quartermaster who'd pioneered systematic weapons trafficking at Long Binh, never faced prosecution for his wartime activities. After Vietnam, he established security consulting firms that provided weapons to conflicts across Africa and Latin America. The business model he developed, selling American equipment to communist forces, became the foundation for a global arms trafficking empire worth hundreds of millions. The intelligence methodologies developed through supply chain infiltration became standard practice for both American and communist intelligence services. The CIA's techniques for tracking weapons flows to identify command structures were applied in Central America, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. Soviet intelligence services adopted similar approaches, using black market weapon sales to map Western military capabilities and recruitment networks. Modern military supply security measures can be traced directly back to lessons learned from Vietnam War corruption. The electronic tracking systems, biometric access controls, and blockchain inventory management used by contemporary military forces all evolved from attempts to prevent the systematic theft that had characterized Vietnam operations. But the most lasting legacy was economic rather than military. The corrupt relationships between former enemies that had developed during the war became the foundation for legitimate business partnerships in the post-war era. Vietnamese officials who'd purchased American weapons during the conflict became trade representatives, facilitating economic cooperation between former adversaries. The Swiss bank accounts that had laundered profits from wartime weapons trafficking became the financial infrastructure for post-war reconstruction investment. American corporations that had profited from military contracts during the war became major investors in Vietnamese economic development. The corruption networks had created personal relationships that transcended political hostilities. Former NVA purchasing agents like Colonel Nguyen Van Duc leveraged their wartime business connections to establish import-export companies that dominated Vietnamese-American trade throughout the 1990s. The same networks that had moved weapons during wartime moved consumer goods during peacetime, generating legitimate profits from relationships forged through criminal enterprises. The psychological impact on military culture proved equally lasting. American military personnel who'd witnessed systematic corruption during Vietnam carried cynicism about military leadership throughout their careers. The knowledge that officers had profited from prolonging conflict while subordinates died created permanent distrust that influenced military morale for generations. Vietnamese veterans faced similar disillusionment. Soldiers who discovered their commanders were selling weapons to the enemy while demanding greater sacrifices from rank-and-file fighters never fully trusted Communist Party leadership again. The corruption revelations contributed to the economic reforms that eventually transformed Vietnamese society. The intelligence networks established through supply chain monitoring became permanent fixtures of global espionage. The techniques developed for tracking weapons flows evolved into methods for monitoring terrorist financing, drug trafficking, and cyber warfare. The shadow economy that had grown around Vietnam War corruption became a model for understanding criminal enterprises worldwide. Most significantly, the Vietnam supply wars established the principle that modern conflicts would be fought as much through economic warfare as military operations. The lesson that industrial capacity ultimately determined military outcomes influenced strategic planning for every subsequent American military intervention. The captured supplies that had shocked Colonel Bui Tin in 1968 represented more than American military abundance. They were harbingers of a world where economic power would become the primary determinant of political influence. Nations that mastered industrial production would shape global affairs regardless of military traditions or ideological commitments. The legacy of the supply wars extended far beyond Vietnam, creating patterns of corruption, intelligence gathering, and economic warfare that continue influencing global conflicts today. Material capacity, not ideology, ultimately determined the Vietnam War's outcome. A lesson that reshapes our understanding of modern conflict entirely. Colonel Bui Tin's final assessment remains brutally accurate. We were fighting America's leftovers, not America itself. The captured supplies revealed industrial superiority so overwhelming that military resistance became mathematically impossible. The sobering truth about power isn't found in political theories or military strategies. It's measured in production capacity, technological advancement, and resource abundance. Nations that can manufacture the most will ultimately determine humanity's political future.